How's it going, AND Camp? This is Justin Giboney, president of the AND Campaign, and this is another civic update where we are trying to raise civic literacy among Christians so that as we go out and engage society, we can do so in a more informed and effective manner. We want to make sure that Christians understand the process, they understand the issues, the spirit of the day, so that we can be effective defenders of human dignity and human flourishing. That's very important to us because we think that's what politics should be all about for Christians, that we should use politics to defend human flourishing, to promote human flourishing and defend human dignity. That's what we're about. Today, I want to talk about a very important criminal justice decision coming out of the Supreme Court. And then I also want to talk briefly about the Jussie Smollett situation. And many of us, because we were paying so much attention to what was going on with Jussie Smollett in the last few days, and also things like Zion Williamson's shoe kind of exploding, many of us may have missed this crucial Supreme Court decision that was unanimous. And let me tell you, we have a very divided Supreme Court right now, divided along ideological lines. Just over half of the justices are considered conservative. The rest of them are considered liberal. And so you very rarely get a decision that's unanimous. But this is a unanimous decision on a very important issue, and you all should know about it. So the case that we're dealing with is the Timms versus Indiana case. And this case was really about the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that basically outlaws the imposition of excessive fines along with cruel and unusual punishment. So what does that mean exactly? Well, what it means is that if I get a speeding ticket, that the government can't charge me or can't fine me $25,000 because I got a speeding ticket. Why? Because that would be disproportionate to the actual violation. That would be excessive. And so our Constitution does not allow those kind of excessive fines. And that's a very important thing to know. In this particular situation, you had a guy named Tyson Timms. And what happened to Tyson Timms in this case was he had his $42,000 Land Rover seized by the state after he was caught, I think, selling $200 or $400 worth of heroin. So $400 worth of heroin, we're going to take your $42,000 Land Rover. So this goes to the trial court. The trial court says, no, this is grossly disproportionate to the actual crime. And along with, in addition to the other fines that he was paying, they said this can't happen. After it goes from the trial court, it goes to the state Supreme Court, not the not the U.S. Supreme Court, but the state Supreme Court. And they come back and say, well, the excessive fines clause does not apply to the states. And therefore, we're going to overturn the ruling of the lower court. So after the state Supreme Court made that ruling, it goes up to the highest court, which is the United States Supreme Court, which came and said, well, actually, because of the 14th Amendment, we're going to overturn the state Supreme Court and say that this does apply to the states. So that the excessive fines clause applies to the states. And that's what this ruling was about. We got this ruling. It was written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which that is a big deal because many of you may know that she's been sick. And so she was well enough to finally come to court and actually write the opinion. So that's good to see. And we hope that that she does well. And she came out and said, look, this is a matter of personal liberty. This is a personal liberty issue. And this was her quote. She said, protection against excessive fines has been a constant shield throughout Anglo-American history for good reason. Such fines, as in this case, undermine other liberties, right? So she's putting this all as a matter of liberty. And because this is still Black History Month, we might mention that excessive fines were used as a tool of oppression. After the Civil War, when you had these black codes and you had Jim Crow, many of these southern states were using excessive fines to hold black people down, really. And so what would happen is I'm jaywalking or something like that, and they hit me with these huge excessive fines that are really just crippling me financially. Right. And so we want to make sure that those were enforced and they couldn't use these excessive fines just to hold people down. But here's the kicker today. The kicker of this ruling today and why it's such a big criminal justice ruling is that the Supreme Court basically said that state and local governments cannot use fines as mechanisms for raising revenue. You cannot use fines as a mechanism for raising revenue. So what was happening was these state and municipal governments were using something called civil forfeiture. Now, what happens with civil forfeiture is if somebody commits a crime and they use their car or somehow their house was involved or some other cash was involved, the state or municipality could take the whole car. They could take the house, they could take the cash, and they could actually use that cash to fund the department, right? So whether that cash, now this is, I want to be very clear, we're not saying that if the house was bought with drug money or if the car was bought with drug money that they should keep it. No, that's not what this is talking about. What they're saying is that you can't use a violation that's disproportionate and take somebody's house, right? So I do something small. I'm selling $200 worth of drugs. You take my whole house. You take my whole car, which really puts people in a bad position. Yes, somebody committed the crime. Yes, they need to be punished. But what we're saying is they don't need to be punished excessively. Right. And so if the only connection was I used the car in the crime or somehow my house was connected or somehow this other money or cash was connected, you can't take that if it's excessive and not directly connected. Right. So this is very helpful because a lot of people, you commit a crime and the thing that you own that's worth the most in your life is taken from you. And a lot of times it's taken from you in the civil process, not a criminal process, a civil process without the same due process as if it was criminal, right? So I'm taking your car or taking your house and I'm not going through the same process as I would need to go through if it was a criminal process, right? The other thing that was happening with these civil forfeitures were when I can take your cash or your house or something like that and I can use it to fund the department or fund the government, it creates a perverse incentive because now as I go out, I may be looking for reasons to find you. I may be setting up traps so I can find you more because at the end of the day, the department is going to get a economic benefit or a revenue benefit from me finding you, which means I'm not just policing, I'm policing to actually get money. And that's just not an incentive that we want people to have. This isn't a way to come at our law enforcement. We know that some of our law enforcement does a very good job, but you don't want to create these perverse incentives. And that's what was happening here. And so this is a huge issue. The AND campaign, Georgia does not do it. A lot of what we do is in Georgia. Georgia does not do a very good job when it comes to civil forfeitures. We looked into kind of changing that law. We'll see how other lower courts interpret this ruling. We may not have to do this. It could wipe out a lot of the civil forfeiture that we've seen, at least the excessive civil forfeiture that we've seen being used in places like Georgia. So really big ruling. Look it up yourself. Again, this was the Thames versus Indiana case. It was about excessive fines and civil forfeitures and using this money, this fine money, to as a source of revenue. Big deal. Big criminal justice ruling that we should all be paying attention to. Lastly, just this Jussie Smollett conversation. I'm sure we have all been hearing about this ad nauseum all day, so I won't go into it too much. But I will say this. The first thing I think we should be doing as Christians is praying for this brother. Obviously, if he faked this crime, faked this hate crime and made up all these details that never really happened and he just orchestrated it, that he's dealing with some serious issues. And the first thing we need to do is pray for the brother in hopes that, that he may find a relationship with God, find a relationship with Jesus, repent and become a believer because he's going through a lot. So that's the first thing that we should do. But something else to think about is if you were one of the people that kind of used this and ran with it before you really had any of the facts, think about that. Because a lot of times what happened and what I saw was before any of this stuff came out, and let me be clear, when something like this comes out, there's no problem with immediately being compassionate, immediately being concerned. All that is good, and I think people should do that. The problem is when you take it, you don't have the facts and you start making allegations or accusations. You start condemning whole groups of people without the facts. We need to think through these things, be a little more critical, not in a negative way, but in a discerning way, to make sure we're not just running along with the crowd and going along with something because it confirms our bias or confirms our preferred narrative. Hope y'all can get with me next week. I'm glad y'all were here. Listen to the Church Politics Podcast. Take care.